Coming up on this episode.
Just because you're in a position of command, authority or rank, i.e. you're a leader or a manager, doesn't mean you're showing leadership.
Yep.
The privilege of leadership says, with the time I am spending with somebody, like you just mentioned there, whether it's 1 year, 2 years or 10 years, how can I impact them in a way where in 20 years' time they remember it and they talk about it?
It is difficult, and I don't think it needs to be, all guns blazing, every single conversation that you have, but even just some general pointers, and make sure it's balanced as well, make sure that feedback is balanced. What is the employee doing well? What is maybe they need to focus on? Send into the employee, that's what we've discussed. Both employee and line manager have a record of that then, don't they, which they can use.
So that notion of situational leadership is still really important, but how would you answer that question? Who's the best leader you've worked for and why?
I'm going to take it back to when I was 16 years old. Okay, so I got a part-time job as a lifeguard at my local leisure centre.
Wow.
And the centre had a facility manager.
Authentic leadership. Mm-hmm. Because the notion of authentic leadership says, well, I'm authentic. I am what I am,
yep.
And I will be who I am. Now, that's going to work with some, and you're going to get it badly wrong with others.
Yeah.
Welcome to the People Performance Podcast. The People Performance Podcast is made up of 3 series. First up, we have the Leader Lounge episodes with founder of T2, Martin Johnson. Then we have the guest interview episodes. And finally, we have our performance episodes delivered by our very own T2 consultants. For now, sit back, tune in and enjoy the People Performance Podcast.
So welcome to the People Performance Podcast with me, Martin Johnson.
And me, Rob MacNaught.
Rob, welcome to the People Performance Podcast. We've worked together for a long time. I say a long time, probably 3 or 4 years.
That's right.
We've always discussed potentially getting you in for the pod.
You have?
Finally, he's conceded and he's here, which is great. Rob is a senior HR business partner for Reckitt. And Rob, why don't you tell us a little bit, running up to this point, what is your background? Where did you get started? How long have you been in HR for? Mm-hmm. All of that good stuff.
Yeah, sure. So HR is actually my second career. So when I finished university, I had no idea what I wanted to do and actually started career in purchasing. So I started as a raw materials assistant and then progressed to a buyer and was purchasing products for kitchens across Europe, which was quite interesting. Amazing role, got to understand supply chain end to end. But ultimately there was something there where I thought, I want to do more with people. And I had the privilege of working with a HR team for the company that I was working for, and I really liked what they did, and I thought, I think that's where I want to go. So I took a brave decision to leave my job, to study a master's degree in HR because I needed to gain that knowledge. And from there, I've never looked back. So started as a HR assistant and have progressed into HR advisor roles and manager roles. I've even done a stint in talent and learning development, and that's brought me where I am today.
What do you think is, what are you most connected to in human resources? I mean, I've done your profiling, right? So I know you're wired for humanism. Yeah. I know that you care about people, and I know that making a difference for people is absolutely in your DNA. But which area of HR, what is it that floats your boat the most, if I was to push you on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very varied role, and I've always stayed in generalist because it's so varied. But I love the learning and development side of things. I love, building capability, but I also love that kind of culture side and team dynamics and seeing people grow within teams and then teams grow as well. So that's what I really tend to kind of navigate towards. Yeah.
And we're only a few seconds in, but I'm just going to push you anyway on it. Is culture, right? We work a lot on it here at T2. We do a lot of podcasts on subjects. We do a lot of leadership stuff. What have you seen as good culture versus poor culture, and what are some of the big rocks that you think fundamentally make the difference in a great culture?
So culture is ultimately the way that we do things, the way that we see things, the way that we feel things. That's for me is what culture is. You walk into a team and you can feel what that culture is. And for strong culture is everybody is living and breathing the same values, the same principles, the same behaviors. That is what great culture is for me. And counteract that, negative culture is you've got people with different agendas, they're doing their own thing, and the team are not working together to achieve a common goal ultimately. So that's what I see as culture. I think it's really interesting because it's something that you constantly have to sense check all the time. Yeah. And it's not about you just do this one-off initiative and then that's it, you're running. You've got to continually sense check it. You've got to continually hold yourself accountable and also others as well. So there's a lot to culture that people don't realize. I think some of the rocks is everybody's busy. Everybody's busy, and it's really important that you set time as a team to really look at yourselves, and not a lot of organizations do that often enough. And I think the more that you can do that, and even if it's at the start of a meeting or an end of the meeting, how are we doing, any behaviors we want to call out or acknowledge that we've done well, that is going to help you on that journey to the culture that you're aiming to achieve.
Awesome. Leadership then, how important is leadership in that? It's sort of a loaded question, isn't it? Because leadership is everything in culture.
Yeah.
We cast the cultural shadow, but what have you seen as best practice where the leaders just get it right? Is there any, I know it's obviously living the same values and behaviours and being aligned, but is there any other leadership qualities that you've observed that particularly drive a really strong culture?
For me, it's discipline and consistency. Those are probably the two big things that I say is if you say you're going to do something, you're going to do it, okay? But also from a team perspective, is you're consistent with your team. And I'm a great believer of, behavior breeds behavior. So if you've got those leaders that are, behaving and leading with the values, the core values, what's been agreed, that behavior will naturally filter down into the rest of the team.
Yeah. Awesome. Wasn't prepared for that, but
nope.
we are in full flow. I like this. But when I get people into the podcast room, I like to go where I feel it should go. And I've known you for a long time. I know you're passionate about these topics. Mm-hmm. So we'll circle back to some of that towards the end.
No worries.
Okay, so what the theme of this podcast really is around the Employment Rights Act. And I know there is significant changes that have recently happened. Mm-hmm. And look, let's be honest. Let's be provocative. In the vast majority, this is including myself, by the way, Rob, in the vast majority of leaders I work with, they don't really care or pay too much attention to this. In general, that's a sweeping statement, but I would say in general. It's sort of the thing that we have to acknowledge and go along with. But it is so important to understand the nuances of an Employment Rights Act. So when you're leading in an organisation, you can lead with balance, fairly, and effectively. Mm-hmm. One of the changes that is coming up, if we just go straight into it, or one of the changes that is in play, should I say, is the unfair dismissal change. Now, for anybody listening to this who's not familiar with that, traditionally, or certainly in recent years, 2 years has been the magic number, where in the first 2 years, and this is where I'm going to ad-lib and Rob's going to correct me if I get anything wrong, but in the first 2 years, you can't really claim an unfair dismissal. After 2 years, you can. That is now changed. That is going to be 6 months.
Yes.
So that's a huge change because as we know, Rob, when you onboard a new employee, 6 months is not a long time. You're still finding your way. Arguably, you're still training that individual. You're still looking at their performance and measuring their effectiveness. And so basically, after 6 months, they can bring unfair dismissal if you choose to exit that employee. So the goalposts have changed, mm-hmm. haven't they? And I guess, again, I'm going to push you this. My first question to you is, as a HR professional, do you think this is a good thing? Or do you think this is going to be a challenging thing and an inhibiting thing for organisations?
It's a great question. I think it's a bit of both, if I'm being honest with you. And I know that seems like it's on the fence, but I think in terms of, employees' rights and the legal framework, that's so important within, the people profession, is we've got to have a strong legal framework. And we've had one in place, for many, many years. What this is doing is effectively raising the bar now. The challenge will be is 6 months is not a long time, as you acknowledge that. And I think actually we have to make decisions before that 6 month period as well, because ultimately, somebody could claim unfair dismissal post that 6 month period.
Sorry, Rob, you make a good point there. So 6 months is the time frame in which somebody then can log unfair dismissal. So effectively, you would need to be measuring performance much earlier than that to make a decision of whether they're right for the organisation.
Exactly.
So you're talking maybe 3 or 4 months. Now, my concern with that is, are we going to potentially be making rash decisions on people based on a shorter window of performance. Because as me and you know, some people hit the ground running and they're a rock star from literally 2 months, 1 month. Some people flourish and blossom later. Some people take 6 to 9 months, and then all of a sudden they become an incredible contributor to the organisation. So the risk might be that we make an early call on somebody that was potentially on a journey to flourish a bit further down the line. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. And I think this probably brings us on to the opportunity, really, is what should organisations be doing? Is that window is very, very short. So I think this is an opportunity now for organisations to look at their recruitment processes. Are they really recruiting for the right people, the right skill set? Yeah, and then also looking at the onboarding, because the onboarding is absolutely critical. Is you've got to remember this person has got a general idea of the organisation, but until they start working there, that's when they really understand the organisation. And onboarding is usually the biggest reason and failure why somebody isn't successful in probation usually. So the more that organisations can really focus on that and make sure that the onboarding is smooth, that it builds on one thing to the next, is going to set the individual up for success, but it's also going to set up the organisation for success as well. Because at the end of the day, the recruitment is an expensive process and it's time consuming as well. So you want to get that right and you want the right candidate in your organisation.
Yeah. So the first salient point on this podcast, isn't it, is if you're listening to this, the game has changed. You need to make sure that your recruitment and onboarding process is of a quality standard.
Yeah.
And I'm not so sure in all the companies I work with that is the case. I still think that, there's many organizations who don't get that right, and therefore they experience the churn and they can't afford to do that as much moving forward. So as part of the onboarding process then, what about clarity of objectives from the outset? So one of the big things I always say in our line of work is when people are trying to perform in their role, they have to know how they are being measured.
Yes.
The first question I think everybody needs to ask their boss is, how are you measuring me? And if that answer is not clear, if that is not written down or clearly articulated or involved in your job description or your KPIs or whatever it might be, then ask for it. But more so, if you're a leader or a manager, let me ask you this question now. For every member of your team, do you have this in place? How are you going to accurately measure and define productivity and performance? And that needs to be done from the outset in
Absolutely.
The onboarding.
Yeah, it does. And then I think to support that as well is you've got to remember is for us in our organisations, we have a problem or we know who to speak to, is a new person doesn't. So how are you supporting that individual to get to know the organisation, to get to know who's who, how we operate, how it all fits together? And I think with your objectives, like you mentioned, and then that support mechanism in place, that's going to really, really help that individual be successful.
And what's on my mind with this, Rob, is are new hires going to feel a little bit of extra pressure? So say employees do this, and they're crystal clear on the objectives from day one. Everybody has clear job descriptions, clear KPIs, even hopefully behavioural KPIs. And then we're going to review it, let's be honest, every 2 weeks from coming into the organisation. Is the leadership style in which we do this, does it count? Because if you don't get the right style around it, new hires can feel almost micromanaged and under pressure from minute one.
Yeah.
And so what the Employment Rights Act has done is brought unfair dismissal down to 6 months to protect the employee. The reverse of that is it could have the opposite effect where they're heavily managed from day one because the clock is ticking and we have to make a decision earlier.
Yeah.
So does the leadership style in which we do this matter?
It's critical. It's absolutely critical, yeah, in terms of how we approach things. And I do agree that there's always pressure when you move roles. You've got to be shown to perform and do well. But I think from a leadership perspective, it's about that two-way communication, is making sure that it's always two-way and you're listening to the new employee. How are they feeling? What support have they had? What do they need additional? Is there any of those unanswered questions that they have? I think the more you need to over-index on that, it will just help massively.
And the other aspect of this is, and again, let's explore this. So effectively, the marker is moving from 2 years to 6 months. However, if we just disregard all of that for a second and just go on the notion of good employers want new hires to succeed, and good new hires want to work for the organisation and succeed.
Yep.
So does anything really change? Because even if you go over 6 months, as long as you are ethical, you are organised, you have process, and you put your best foot forward, then this doesn't mean to say that on 7, 8 or 9 months you still can't decide that that person is not right, and you can still exit them from the business for the right reasons, following the right process, and you're protected against unfair dismissal anyway. Does that make sense? So, like, instead of worrying about, I have to make this decision before 6 months and rushing a process, yes, we've got to be more organised and we've got to manage and lead. But if the intent on both sides is there and you are an ethical employer who follows process, what this is not saying is you still can't not make a decision further down the line. No. That might still be the case, right?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. And you can go down a performance management process. What is key is that performance management process is fair, it's well documented, and it's designed ultimately to get the employee up to the standard. Okay, but ultimately, if that employee doesn't get up to that standard, then naturally there could be warnings issued, and then ultimately, the worst case scenario is that an employee would be dismissed from the organisation.
Let me move on to this then. So assuming that everything we've just said, if leaders and organisations find themselves in a situation where they've crossed the 6 months and they do want to make a decision for the right reasons, and they do, extended time limits in the new Employee Rights Act for tribunals, so cases that could be taken to tribunals or logged for it, is increasing from 3 months after leaving the organisation to 6 months.
Correct.
So this is saying if someone does feel like they have been unfairly dismissed or treated, they have 6 months now. So 5 months down the line, you could think it's all fine and everything's quiet. That could come back on you.
That's true.
So what does this mean? I mean, I wonder why they've changed that. Do they think that on reflection sometimes it takes time and people reflect back and think, actually, I was not quite happy with that? Whatever that reasons are. But is there, there's nothing employers can do on this, I guess. It's just being mindful that you're not out the woods after 3 months.
I think it's around, you've got to have a fair process in place and you've got to treat people fairly. And what it also, I think, it stresses the importance of is having very clear evidence and documentation to be able to justify your actions and why you did things. Because in 6 months' time, we forget what happened last month, never mind in 6 months. So, if a claim comes in 6 months, it's actually a really long-winded process. So it might be then the following year before you have the first preliminary hearing, and then there'll be, the witness statements exchanged until you actually get to the tribunal where you're in front of the judge, going through the case. So it's a really, really long process, and naturally people forget. So it's really important from an evidence perspective that all of that is collated. It's very clear why things have happened. And potentially even, if you feel that something's going towards an employment tribunal, is get witness statements early. Okay, so things are jotted down so that when people come back and reflect on it, they say, yes, I remember why that happened now and things.
Do you, in your experience, do you think this is one of the biggest gaps in leadership and management, where in our general one-to-one sessions and coaching meetings and performance reviews, we have them, we come away from them, we get busy in meetings and on calls, and we forget to do the follow-up, the write-up, the documentation, so there's no evidence of that conversation and what agreement. Do you think that's one of the biggest gaps? Because my view from working with people is that gets missed a lot. It does.
The reality is being a leader is a real difficult job, and it, not to be underestimated. It's really, really challenging. But yeah, if you're having performance concerns, you've got to have that open, honest conversation, but give that employee the opportunity to improve, give them that feedback verbally, show them, coach them, additional training. So the goal of this is to get the employee up to the required standard of performance. So the more that you can support them with that, that's going to help them and help you ultimately, because then you're not going to have to go through the performance management process. But what we see from a HR perspective is managers will come up and say, this person's not performing. And then when we ask, what have you done about it? That's when things start to get a little bit vague and a little bit woolly. And effectively, we have to then start the process again.
I was going to ask you about that. What good practice versus poor practice in engaging your HR partner. I bet you lose the will to live with the amount of people who go, right, I've had enough. We need to act on this person. And then you go, okay, where are we? What have we done? And they go, well, I've come to you now, right? And you go, well, is there nothing, no evidence, no performance reviews, no coaching, no investment? Is there anything that you've done that we can actually... Well, no. And all of a sudden you think, right, well, we've got to start the process now. It must drive you crazy. But at the same sense, like you say, leaders and managers are busy. But in the absence of proper process and evidence and documentation, you can't do anything, can you? So the problem I think most leaders have, Rob, who I speak to, is they say it can feel a bit overkill to document everything. If every meeting with your employee, every single time you talk about how things are going and how we can improve and areas to build on, if that is followed up with a really structured document, it can make it feel a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? A little bit contrived, a little bit like, oh, am I under the pump here? Is this building evidence against? People can become mistrusting if it's too robotic and structured. So it's difficult, isn't it?
It is difficult, and I don't think it needs to be, all guns blazing, every single conversation that you have, but even just some general pointers, and make sure it's balanced as well, make sure that feedback is balanced. What is the employee doing well? What is maybe they need to focus on? Sending to the employee, that's what we've discussed. Both employee and line manager have a record of that then, don't they, which they can use. I think the other thing as well is what is critical is actually enhancing the capability of the leaders in the organisation. And that's something that we've done in many organisations that I worked with, is actually allowing managers to understand what the law is. How do they go about an investigation? How do they manage performance? How they have the right to manage people as well, and what the right way is about that. And I think the more that you can invest in that capability, the stronger your leadership teams are going to be in the organisation.
It's a really good point. Over the last 5 years, I follow the trends of the top priorities of all organisations. Leadership and management development is always in the top three. Obviously T2, we exist to help with the soft skills of leadership and how you lead people and self-awareness and driving culture and leadership styles and all of that stuff. But understanding the mechanisms and the law aspect is really important, because sometimes, Rob, I feel in the modern day world than ever, leaders feel a little bit powerless. They feel like it's heavily stacked on the other side. They can't say anything. They can't do anything. I wrote a piece recently that I felt we've gone from an assertive, hierarchical leadership style to more of a supportive, empathetic, compassionate leadership style in general in organisations. And neither extremes are good. We talk about it all the time, that if you're too assertive and you're too results driven on expectations and accountability, you drive performance, but you lose people.
Yeah.
And if you're too supportive and too afraid of having conversations and too worried about the kickback and the repercussions of remotely managing a situation, you're going to engage your people but lose performance.
Yeah.
And so I think we're at this precipice of courage with leadership. Do managers feel confident, or do they feel like they're trying to do it with one hand tied behind their back and they're afraid of the kickback? And I think that's the problem we've got to solve together, isn't it? How do we give people the confidence to understand they have a right to lead, they have a right to manage, they shouldn't avoid performance conversations,
No.
They've got to protect the organisation as well as cater for the human. It's such a fine balance, isn't it?
It is. And what I would say is, in terms of the performance concerns that we're talking about, this is a very, very small minority in the organisation, and they will crop up now and again. It's not every day. So, but in a career, as somebody as a leader in their career, they will have to face this situation at some point. So I think it comes back to what you said at the start, is making sure that everybody in the team has very clear expectations, okay, as to how they're going to be, what they need to perform, and how they're going to be measured on that, basically. And then, as a leader, you're using that then to measure. You're going to have to adapt your style, because people will respond very, very differently in different ways. So therefore, you, as a leader, you're going to have to adapt in order to try and get the best out of people. And I think that's really important. What leaders need to understand is, why are we clashing, for example? Why do we have this challenge all the time? And it's probably because you just have very different styles, and actually all you need to do is just meet in the middle somewhere, and you find something that works for both parties. And that's what we see a lot.
The worst kind of leader is the one who says, well, I am who I am.
Yes.
Take it or leave it. I'm authentic. This is why I think we've got to be really careful. I challenge it sometimes, Rob, around authentic leadership. Because the notion of authentic leadership says, well, I'm authentic. I am what I am,
Yep.
and I will be who I am. Now, that's going to work with some, and you're going to get it badly wrong with others.
Yeah.
When we've worked with you guys, for example, we always talk about situational leadership, which is what you're talking around.
Yep.
Yes, be your authentic self and understand what that looks like. Do the work to understand what that looks like. But you've got to develop the skill set to recognize when you've got to push outside of that and slightly take a step in somebody's direction.
Exactly.
Authentic leadership, the authentic leaders who say, I am who I am, take it or leave it, it's quite a dangerous leadership style, certainly in the modern day.
Yeah.
Let me transition into that. Generations. We have 5 generations in the workplace now. We've still got baby boomers. I don't think we have any silent generation. We might do. So if you are out there might be the odd one. We have baby boomers. We have Gen X. We have millennials. We have Generation Z. And now we've got Alpha and Beta coming through. So we've got this really interesting dynamic of this generational shift in organizations, which is creating more havoc for leaders.
Yeah.
Because as we know, with the younger generations coming through, they have different attachment styles. They like to be communicating different ways, right? They are digital natives. So they prefer communication digitally rather than face-to-face. So we've got this huge discrepancy in the way the leader can interact and feed back to different generations. Are you seeing that in your workplace and in general? And what's your view on the future of different generations being in the workplace and how leaders need to try and cater for that?
Yeah, we've always seen different generations, and we've seen, everything's different in organisation in terms of our age, our gender, all of that. And that will continue to change, throughout our careers. I actually see it as an opportunity. I see it as a real opportunity for leaders to learn different styles, different approaches and things like that. And actually we should celebrate that diversity because we could learn from each other. And I think, a lot of organizations, they've really dialed up the diversity inclusion agenda, and they've spent a lot of time on that. For that reason is they're seeing so many benefits from educating people around, different challenges, different expectations. Why are they different? Understanding all of that and then using it to their advantage. Yeah. And a great example is, you might have an employee who's disabled, and they may not be able to do X, Y, and Z. But do you know what? There's a load of other stuff that they can do, and they've got some really good skill sets to adapt to situations and things. We should be learning and celebrating that. So I think, yes, it can be challenging for leaders, but what a great opportunity it is to grow and develop.
I like that, and I always say this, and to all leaders who are of our generation or the generation before, when you start going, the problem with the young uns today is, and they don't make them like they used to, and you can't speak to anybody in any way anymore. I say, whoa, hang on a second, rewind. In the history of evolution, nothing that has come after has ever adjusted to what came before. It's always an evolution of.
Yes.
So you can't stand there and say they don't make them like they used to, and why can't they just adjust to me? They're the evolution, right? We've created that.
Yeah.
We've created the world of which has created that. So we've got to cater for them, right? And adjust to them. And it really makes people think. They don't like it, but it really makes people think. So I just think the jump in the technological advancement, the digital industrial revolution, the emergence of AI, parenting styles, the comfort crisis, the world we live in, I think it's just been a huge jump for the first time in a long time in terms of the difference.
Yeah.
The difference in the younger generation
significant.
It is significant, and we've got to keep banging the drum on that and keep, having those conversations. I think because it is really important. So I love this, Rob. I'm going everywhere with this. So leadership styles are important. Making sure your process is important. Making sure you understand generational difference is important, and develop the skills to be adaptive and change to an environment. As a HR professional, Do you feel it's your job to protect and represent an organisation, or protect and represent people and employees, or both? Now, I know which answer you're going to probably say. How do you find that balance? Is that the ultimate thing of a good HR individual? 100% impartial, looking at a situation objectively for how it is, not better nor worse, and trying to drive the right outcome for both parties. I'm guessing that's the line you're going to go down, but I'm really interested because that must be difficult at times.
Yeah, it's difficult, but it's a critical skill set for any HR professional, is you've got to go in there objectively, and you can achieve both. You can absolutely achieve both. But it's about, if a manager's pulling you in one direction, saying it's this, this, and this, is about just taking a step back, looking at things holistically, and then advising on that approach. And I think where I've seen organisations fail is where they've gone too one-sided, and that's where the issues start to arise. But yeah, for me, is you've got to look at this objective. You've got to be prepared as well to challenge the leader, if they've stepped out of line, but also the employee as well. If there has been a situation, and again, it doesn't happen very often, but if they step out of line, you've got to hold that employee to account as well. So it's finding that balance, but over time you do get it right.
Yeah, and I guess you've seen it happen before, where if as a HR professional you remotely get influenced or lean into one side, you're not doing your job properly.
No.
And yeah, I think people can see it as well.
100%.
I think you're going to get found out doing
100%, yeah.
Yeah. So in the future then, Rob, one of the biggest challenges organisations are going to face, not just as a result of the Employee Rights Act constantly evolving and constantly changing and morphing, where leaders and organisations have to adapt and think about the way they do things. But one of the biggest challenges, I think, for all businesses is retention, keeping good people. Or just keeping people. If you think about it now, people have more choice than ever. Like, do you remember, if you look at, even 20, 30 years ago, generally you got jobs within your proximity of your living residence.
Yep.
And so you had a number of employees in the area, big employees, and then you had a load of mid-size and a load of small. So your options were usually bound by proximity. And therefore employers were fishing in a much larger local pond for talent. And so people tended to stay around a little bit longer. The favour was stacked on the employee side. You fast forward to today, and anyone can work anywhere in the world, from your back bedroom, from home. No longer are you bound by working for the same number of employers in an area. So the talent fight is real, isn't it?
Yeah.
And if you're not creating an environment where people are happy, they can go somewhere else very, very quickly.
Absolutely, they can.
So everybody's worried about talent, and the world's changing around us as well. So what do you see as super important for employers to get right if we're going to keep talent? I mean, I know there's loads of things, but what you're seeing, because you must go through all these exit interviews and all these reasons as to why people move on, all these incoming interviews around why people want to join. What do we need to be mindful of in terms of importance, would you say?
Yeah, it's a massive area about it. I think what was really interesting is kind of post-lockdown is, I think we saw a real shift in attitude. As a lot of people said, that was pretty horrific. And actually, I'm going to start living life, and I want to be closer to my family. So we saw a lot of people that have maybe moved to the area, moved back closer to their families, which was quite interesting. We've also seen the move from fully remote working to now a bit of a hybrid approach, to some organisations saying you're in the office 5 days a week as well. And naturally, that's caused people to decide, is this right for me? Because people's attitudes have changed kind of post-COVID.
Well, let me just ask you about that. Flexible working in the new Employee Rights Act. What I didn't realise is all employees have the right to request flexible working, and they can formally request that twice per year. Now, what I will say about this for any employers out there is, employers do have the right to turn that down for valid reasons. A couple of the reasons might be if it's going to impact the quality of work, or it's going to impact on performance, or you can't meet customer demands, or your job role requires you to be at a specific location, so it's impossible to offer remote or flexible working. So it's a conversation. It's a right of an employee to request, I want flexible working, or to hybrid working, or whatever it might be. I think a lot of people post-pandemic have struggled with this, a lot of organisations, because what they found was, I can't get people back now when we're losing accountability and performance. Right, we're all back in 5 days a week. Mm-hmm. And it's a really challenging subject for everybody. But I think what you're saying is, and with the younger generations, we've got to consider it where we can, because people are looking for it.
Yeah, people are looking for it. People want that. And I think, if you've got an individual that's in their diary, back-to-back Teams calls all day, why do they need to come into the office for that? If they've got a good internet connection at home, they can do that. They can avoid the commute.
If it's someone like, for example, a finance person who is heavily transacting what they do on a computer, on Teams calls, there's no reason why in that function they couldn't do it. If you're a creative in the marketing department, maybe some days in the office is because you're doing your creative brainstorming and your collaboration, and that's going to be more effective face-to-face. So it really is down to role, isn't it?
It's down to role. I think it's also down to the organisation as well, is what works for them. I mean, like some organisations have said we'll go fully remote because it works for us. The challenge then comes back to culture, is how do you feel part of an organisation that you're kind of separate from? Yeah. Other organisations have gone more hybrid and maybe done it role specifically. So, for example, if it's somebody working in a factory, you can't do that role at home. That's fact, And then others have gone very extreme and said 5 days in the office. That's how we're going to operate. So it's quite interesting to see that. But it really depends on the organisation as what they need, what they require, obviously what their goals are as well.
Yeah, we worked with an organisation recently, and we had to put this in place because what you had is, even if you had a construction worker who had to go out into the field and do their job physically, and then you had a back office finance support function, there was still resentment building between the people who had to be on site versus the people who were at home. Yeah. And it was like, well, it's all right for them because this. So what I said is, have you categorized your workers? I said, you can have 3 categories of workers. You can have wholly on-premise because your job requires you to do something. If you're a telephone engineer, you're a wholly on-premise worker. You can have wholly remote, which says you really don't have to be in. You can do your entire job remotely, and we will entrust you to do that. Or there's hybrid. Yeah. We're going to require you a few times a week or whatever it might be for these reasons to be collaborative and in an office, but the rest of the time you can work from home. I said, and is it not time that as organisations, as part of that onboarding or job offers, we categorise them as one of the 3? From the outset, they know if they're an on-premise, a wholly remote, or a hybrid worker. Yeah. That's probably what we've got to do. We've got to try and categorise them in the job offers and the job descriptions, so it's not changing halfway through and people are building resentment. You know exactly what you're walking into.
Exactly, and if you're on a hybrid role, there's nothing stopping you coming in the office 5 days a week if you want to, so you've got that flex still within it, but ultimately there's the option there is if you need to work hybrid, you've got that option to do so.
Right, as we transition towards the end, Rob, because I could speak to you all day. You clearly love it. You're really passionate and knowledgeable in your areas. Let me loop back to leadership. Who's the best leader you've worked for, and why? And I ask that question to everybody because in all my time in this field, you meet many different people and many different leaders, and I always get a bit of a different answer to this, depending on and it absolutely tells the point that leadership is different things to different people, and different people have different requirements from leaders. So that notion of situational leadership is still really important. But how would you answer that question? Who's the best leader you've worked for and why?
That's a real difficult question because I have worked and worked with some amazing leaders. I'm going to take it back to when I was 16 years old. Okay, so I got a part-time job as a lifeguard at my local leisure centre. Wow. And the centre had a facility manager. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but I would say he was one of the best leaders. And the reason why I say that is because he knew that me and also my colleagues that worked there, a lot of them, we were going to be there for 2 years, 5 years max if we went to university and stayed working in the organisation, and then we were probably going to leave. Okay, that's just the nature of it. But the thing is he took the time to get to know you, understand your journey where you are up to today, why you're studying the subjects that you're studying, what's your career path, and he used to coach you and he used to mentor you and he used to give you really great advice, even though he knew that he wasn't necessarily developing you for the longer term, but you were only going to be there. And some of my colleagues, they would only come in when they had time off university, for example, so you never used to see them for most of the year. But he took that time to invest in you and he gave you some great advice. And some of the advice that he gave me, I still think about today because it was that impactful. So he was definitely a great leader and somebody that I really highly respected. Yeah.
I absolutely love that because I once did a talk on stage not so long back called Leadership is a Privilege. And I said it's a privilege because just because you're in a position of command, authority or rank, i.e. you're a leader or a manager, doesn't mean you're showing leadership.
Yeah.
The privilege of leadership says, with the time I am spending with somebody, like you just mentioned there, whether it's 1 year, 2 years or 10 years, how can I impact them in a way where in 20 years' time they remember it and they talk about it. And I tell these two stories of these two leaders that hugely impacted me and why I'm still talking about it. And I didn't expect you to say when I was 16. I expected you to probably go back to something like something in your corporate life, but that's why leadership is a privilege. That example you've given there, you could have given any other example, but 20, 25 years later, whatever it is, Rob, you're still remembering that person. Even though you were there for a short amount of time, it didn't matter to that individual. It was, how can I spend this time wisely, mentor and help and support these people in such a way that it will set them up for success?
Yeah.
And I think that's a great way to probably finish the podcast. I think if you're out there thinking about leadership as a privilege, thinking about culture, thinking about our responsibility, I think the one thing that's made me think on this podcast, Rob, is it helps me reconnect with the responsibility we have
Absolutely.
as leaders. Yes, we're talking about Employment Rights Acts, and we're talking about things changing from 2 years to 6 months in terms of unfair dismissal, and we're talking about all of this stuff, this HR stuff. However, it fundamentally comes down to leadership is a privilege. It's difficult. I think that's one thing we're saying. It is difficult.
It is.
We get why some leaders are hesitant and feel, they feel quite worried and daunted about certain action and being a certain way. And what we want to liberate those people to do the right thing. And what we're saying today, Rob, is have your processes in place, do the right thing, and make sure you understand the law. You might know him in Hull, but a great employment law solicitor that I've engaged with before, Ted at Goschalks, Ted Flanagan.
Yeah.
He's like a good old mentor of mine, and he's taught me so much. And he says the same thing. He says, if you understand it and if you educate yourself on the actual law, you will realise it is not stacked in either direction.
No.
It's there to protect everybody.
It is.
And it's there to be fair and just.
It is.
And I think that's the main thing we need to get across with this, isn't it?
It totally is. And to the point around that education, this is one of the biggest changes we have seen in a long time. And we've had change already in February. We've got change now. We've got further changes this year and then at the start of 2027. So there's lots coming, and it's coming really, really quickly as well. So it's going to impact every single organisation. So the more that you can get educated with it, yes, stuff might not impact you directly now, but it may do in the future. There will be other stuff, for example, changes in sick pay, changes in, rights to paternity on day one, all of those type of things that are going to impact your organisation now. So if you haven't already, you need to start working on it ASAP.
We might think it's dry and it's employment law and all the rest of it. It's super important.
It really is.
Educate yourself, or speak to somebody who can educate you. We want to be confident in organisations that we can lead and lead with confidence. And remember, it's about the middle ground. It's not about being overly accommodating and supportive, because you will absolutely engage people but lose performance. And it's certainly not about being overly assertive and aggressive, because you will get yourself in trouble and you will lose people. It's about being balanced and understanding what good balanced leadership looks like. Good, fair and honest leadership. Rob MacNaught, I could talk to you all day long. Super job.
Thank
you.
You
enjoyed
Martin.
Yourself?
It's been great. It's been really good, actually, yeah. Thank you for having us.
You're welcome. We might get you on another one and do a follow-up. But we will, that was all for now. Hopefully that's been of interest. Drop your comments on the episode if you've got any comments for me and Rob that you want to talk about, and we can answer them. And we will be back shortly with another People Performance podcast.